everyone and welcome to the first part of the morrigan's process. Let's get started with this new figure from Journeyman Miniatures. This is an image of a color render of the sculpture, which we are also going to use as a reference to paint our version. We think it is very interesting because, as you can see, it has several light focuses and it also has a very interesting ambience. We will make some modifications and adaptations because the size of the figure is not very big. It was going to be a little bit difficult to create some of these effects. As you can see, the piece is fully primed and ready. David painted this piece a while ago, and that's why the palette appears on the left side as in the old videos. Then it will change to the right side. We are going to start by adding some colors to the palette. What we are going to see in this part is how to start working on the ambience of the piece. One of the most important and interesting things that we think you are going to be able to see in this process is how to create quite soft gradients and blendings in quite small areas. We think you're going to find this interesting because you won't find this method difficult and it's very useful to paint not very large volumes, like these ones we have here. We're going to start by mixing a few tones, mainly because we're going to look for a grayish tone for the skin. So we are going to add this tone as a base to create a quite dark ambience. The real problem we are going to have with the skin is how to make it look quite vivid, quite natural. To do this, we chose to start from a quite grayish base and we are going to saturate it. We are going to add intensity and liveliness to the skin, adding tones in a quite measured and slow way. We don't want to exaggerate it because the ambience that we want to achieve is quite dark. The tone we are looking for is a quite grayish blue tone, a quite muted tone, to start creating the ambience that we want to achieve. It will also be very important to add more amount of red gradually to the skin, pink, purple, to add more liveliness and naturalness. We have covered more or less all the surface of the skin with this base tone. And before we continue working on the skin, we are going to add the base color to all the nearby elements to start seeing the ambience that we want to achieve following the render reference that we have seen at the beginning of the video. As in other projects, we recommend you not to start working on an element if the rest of the piece is still with the black primer. It doesn't matter if the primer is white, black or grey because it will condition all the work we do. We add this pink horror from Citadel little by little, which is a pink tone that contains a lot of red. We add it to the grayish mix to get these muted pink or red grayish tones. This is going to add a lot of liveliness. Following as a reference the image that we saw at the beginning of the process, we are also going to paint some other elements like the fabric that we have on the side. We opted for a quite grayish base color, a little muted, so as not to oversaturate any area more than necessary. We think it is better in this case to add color and saturation little by little. We did the same on the shield. Especially now, what we are starting to do is to mark the elements and areas that will have more highlights and color. The most important ones, we could say. Although at this point there are still very dark and primed areas. You know that sometimes David doesn't use the pieces of advice he gives you. We want to start working on the skin mostly because we want to mark some light planes. This is mainly because those areas of the skin are the most important ones of the piece, and the rest of the elements that are still unpainted will be less striking. Once the skin is more advanced, it will help us paint the rest of the parts, because those parts will never have such high contrast and will be much more muted. You can see that we are already adding to the skin some more vivid and saturated tones, such as these greenish tones. In addition, to compensate our balance, we mixed with the pinkish tones. Why do we do this? Because in the end, pink has a lot of red and is the complementary color of green, and therefore it will desaturate. We are going to make the skin more grayish and more natural. We don't want it to be too greenish or too pink. One really nice thing about this piece is that the light planes of the skin are very marked. They are very easy to spot. We continue adding color to some parts that are still unpainted. In this case, for example, the rock just behind the head. See that we won't cover the top of the rock, the sides and the back with this stone, because one of the most interesting effects that we will try to achieve following the reference will be to create the backlight effect, where the top of the rock and the back are much more highlighted. Those areas are hit by light, a quite warm light, that comes from somewhere nearby and mostly from the back of the piece. This is quite interesting because it creates a backlight effect. To start achieving this effect, we are going to start using much warmer colors for the back and top areas. Here you can see that we have added those base colors, we have been working on some areas that were left to paint, and we have also started painting that magical effect in the rock that is not in the illustration in the reference, and that later David is going to cover because he didn't like it. It was an option, but David thinks that Dutch blue was too flashy and that the piece already had enough light focuses to add another one just behind the head. It was too risky. What we are going to do right now is to continue working on the skin. We are going to try to create a great contrast by highlighting the light plane quite well, marking the light plane right on the leg here. We mark that light with a quite light tone, and we are going to soften the gradient by adding different tones. You can see that in this case we are going back to pink to make it a little bit more natural. We go back to adding some more flat earth that also has quite a bit of yellow or green in it. You can really see that we are going to work on the skin with a few tones, a few different colors. We are going to continuously compensate those greenish tones with the pinkish ones. For example, in some areas that might be a little softer like the knee, we are going to add more amount of red. When we talk about red, keep in mind that it can be in many different forms. Pink tones, reddish browns, orangey reds, anything that contains red. If we use a red that is too saturated, too primary, we would modify the saturation and intensity of the ambience we are looking for, and it would be too exaggerated. See that we can still see that highlight we added to the light plane of the leg. We're going to work like this all the time. We're going to add highlights with quite a lot of white, with tones that contain quite a lot of white, very light tones. And then we're going to soften the gradient with darker but more intense tones. They're going to have less amount of white. We highlight again the volume of the leg. Look at the direction of the brushstrokes. We are doing this to round the volume because the leg is quite cylindrical. The direction of the brushstroke is very important. And we are going to do the same in other areas of the skin. We mark the volumes of the face with a very light tone. This color sketch of the face will help us create a great contrast and start defining those volumes. We are going to increase the contrast by adding an even stronger highlight in that area of the leg. What we are looking for above all is to have a first approach to the volume of the skin, to the volume of the piece, to start creating a great contrast and to have more or less clear what the light and shadow approach will be. Then we will worry about smoothing all this. Remember that we are following the visual color reference of the render that we saw at the beginning of the video. Little by little, we are adding some more intense tones to the tone we have used for the highlight. They are also darker because they have less amount of white. We are adding blue tones, reddish browns, flat earth, and we are smoothing the highlight that we have added. We are going to add these tones on top of this very light tone because it is already a very white highlight. We don't want to continue highlighting. We have to start darkening but with more saturated tones, with less amount of white. For example, for the areas that are closer to the chest or the neck area, we are going to use pinkish tones because they are softer areas, and these pinkish tones will add some very natural touches. This way we are going to blend the much darker tone that we have as a base with the very light highlight. We are going to make the gradient much softer by adding these tones in between. We are going to lose contrast, but that is what should happen. We will add more highlights later. We also take the chance to highlight a little bit more some areas that are too dark. We are going to do exactly the same in the face area. It is important that this tone that we are adding in between or on top of the previous work is not excessively dark. Otherwise, we would be going back to the beginning, to the base color. It has to be an intermediate tone between the base color and the strong highlight that we added before. Actually, the goal with this is that when we add this color on top of the darker areas, it will look darker, and when we add it to the highlight areas, it will look lighter. Although it may look like we are ruining the previous work, don't worry about that because it will still be visible. What's going to happen once we do this? We are going to lose contrast. We are adding a tone darker than the highlight but lighter than the shadow. We are softening the contrast of the gradient, and therefore we will now have to add highlights again to generate a higher contrast. We have to take into account that the skin, the color of the skin that we are looking for, or the ambience we are looking for, is quite muted, quite dark. And in this case, we are going to have to achieve a great light and shadow contrast because, for example, with color, we are not going to create a very intense saturation contrast. We go back to work on the highlights, but you can see that in this case we are not using a very light tone with too much white, because otherwise we will enter a loop in which we are going to repeat the same thing over and over. Now we are going to start painting in a very careful way because we already have the light plane very well marked. Now we are not going to need a tone with so much white. We mark the volumes of the face again, but in this case with a tone with less amount of white, so that the contrast is not so exaggerated. We are now going to use this darker tone to define the lips, the mouth. And with the light tone, we outline well to define the upper lip better. We will continue to generate a greater contrast by making the light tone lighter. And as you can see, we are going to be much more precise. We make the tone a little bit darker for the areas that won't have the strongest highlights. In this case, we're adding flat earth. And we also take the chance to blend with the highlight that we just added. Doing it this way, we achieve several things. We smooth that highlight that we just added, and we also make the highlight area warmer, in this case more greenish or yellowish. We are adding more color to the highlights, because the highlight we added before contained much more amount of white. In this case, it has more color. Actually, what we are doing is quite similar to when, for example, we want to get a very striking red, a very intense red. And what we do is that before adding that red, we put a base or a layer of white so that then the red on top looks much more intense. In this case, as we are working with very grayish colors, with very grayish tones, when we add them, for example, on top of the white, they will look much brighter, much more vivid. See that we have softened some areas that were darker by adding a lighter tone on top, because we don't need such a large contrast on that side of the face, because it's light enough. If we keep that big shadow, it will create a contrast that won't look natural. As you may have realized, we haven't painted the other side of the face yet, because it's going to be much darker and it will have a rim light because of the light of the candles, the OSL of the candles. That candlelight will help us define the other side of the face. We continue enhancing the contrast in the face and also looking for more definition. This face is not easy to interpret because the volumes are very soft and subtle. Because they are so subtle, it can be difficult to add contrast and also to get definition. We are adding these warmer tones now to create the candlelight effect. Remember that we are following the visual reference that we have seen at the beginning of the video. The lighting that this side is going to have is going to be quite different, since the candlelight is coming from below. It's a much lower light than the ambience light. We are going to be adding these slightly warmer tones, also mixing with the blue and green tones that we've been using for the skin. It is important not to go too crazy and use a red or orange that is too saturated, too intense. Otherwise, we will make the candlelight effect look too exaggerated. To make that lighting look quite subdued, we have to use this kind of orange or brown tones. And we are going to add saturation little by little. Now we add Avalanche Sunset to the palette, which is an ochre yellow or a quite yellowish ochre tone. We are now going to add some highlights on this darker side but corresponding to the main ambience. In this case, when we have two light sources, the ambience light that would be the one on the right side and the light that comes reflected by another object, it is an OSL that would come from the candles, we have to choose which one has more prominence, which one is more intense and which one predominates over the other, because this will help you to understand the effect better. In this case, the strongest or more intense light would be the ambience light. The candle light would be a dimmer light. If the candlelight was much more intense, the other side, the right side, would be much darker. These tones that we are using for the side of the candles are more greenish or yellowish. In short, they are warmer. Although they correspond to the ambience light, they are affected by the OSL of the candles. So we are going to see these warmer and more saturated tones. With these highlights, it's very clear that the ambience light is more prominent. It's more intense than the candlelight. Now, with this darker tone, what we are going to do is to emphasize and increase the shadow contrast. It will also help us define the shadow areas. And this is all for today, but I remind you that at the end of this month we will upload the first part of one of the projects that David has prepared for World Model Expo. Only you, the students, will be able to see it before David uploads the final photos. We are sure you're going to love it. You, the students of the Academy, will be able to see it before anyone else. I hope you liked the first part of Morrigan and we'll see you in the next video. Bye!